our Simply Neurathon. This is our science policy session. Thank you guys all so much for coming. Our speaker is Dr. Meredith. I don't know how to Schmehl. I'm saying that wrong. Feel free to correct me.
Schmehl. Yeah, Schmehl.
Yeah, and I'm going to give her a quick intro before letting her just go ahead and take the stage. So Meredith Schmehl is a neuroscientist, science communicator, and science policy advocate. She is the Digital Media and Communications Coordinator and the Public Engagement and Communications Chair of the National Science Policy Network, where she creates accessible and visual content, leads a team in communicating science policy topics, and engages members in professional development opportunities. She has also led advocacy projects as an early career policy ambassador with the Society for Neuroscience and has written about science policy through Duke University. Outside of science policy, Meredith is an independent science communicator and advocate through several multimedia and outreach projects that authored award-winning articles in outlets such as the Scientific American and Massive Science. Previously, she organized ComSciCon Triangle 2021 workshop and was associate editor of the Duke Science Review. Meredith is a PhD candidate in the Department of Neurobiology at Duke University, where she studies how the brain uses vision to process sound. Find Meredith on her website, meredithschmehl.com, or on Twitter at Meredith Schmehl. And again, thank you so much for being here. Feel free to go ahead and take the stage, Meredith.
Great, thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here, and I'm really excited to be able to share some of my science policy knowledge with all of you. I am going to have to turn off my camera here just to make sure that my screen sharing and audio stays smooth, but I wanted you to see my friendly face. So hi, this is what I look like. I'm going to turn off my camera and go ahead and share my screen. So great. Like Catherine said, my name is Meredith Schmehl. I am a neuroscientist who also has experience in science policy. So I'm really excited to share with you some of those experiences today. I just want to say that I want to keep this a little bit more interactive than just me talking at you for an hour. So I am going to spend a lot of time talking, but feel free to leave your questions in the chat throughout the talk, and I'll pause a few times and check the chat to answer questions throughout. So before we really dive in, I would like to hear from all of you. So to start this active chat session, I want to know, where are you coming from in terms of your education level and your level of comfort with science policy? So if you're comfortable, let me know in the chat, what is your current education level? And on a scale between 1 and 5, how much do you feel like you know about science policy? Where 1 means I'm a complete newbie and I have no idea what science policy is, and 5 means I'm an expert and I already have experience. So go ahead and drop that in the chat and let's see who we have here. Okay, seeing a lot of 3s. We got a 1 and a 2. It looks like we have a lot of high school and college students, but maybe also some PhD students. So that's awesome. So it looks like we're really ranging between 1 and 3 in terms of our level of comfort with science policy. So that is great. And that's actually perfect for this session. So I'm aiming for this to be Science Policy 101. So I'm not expecting you to come with any prior knowledge about what science policy is. This is just a brief introduction to the field as a whole. So that is really awesome. And I hope that you learned something today. So I know that you already heard a little bit about me, but I think it's helpful to hear it directly from the person speaking as well. So I wanted to take a brief moment and just introduce myself a little bit further. So again, my name is Meredith Schmehl. I am part of a group called the National Science Policy Network, and I'll be talking about that group a bit more towards the end. But what I do there is I'm part of the staff as the Digital Media and Communications Coordinator. So I do a lot of marketing and branding for the organization, as well as I'm a leader of a committee called the Public Engagement and Communications Committee, which is a committee focused on science communication. And I'll also talk about that a bit later, but basically what that means is we lead a lot of projects that are focused on sharing science with the public or training our members to share science with the public. And then alongside all of this, I am a PhD candidate at Duke University studying neurobiology. So just like all of you, I am a neuroscience enthusiast. I really like brains. So hopefully we kind of have a point of connection there, and maybe some of you can see a path forward into science policy based on your neuroscience experience. So even though this is going to be a talk about science policy, because this is a neuroscience group, I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about my neuroscience interests, just so you can kind of see my path so far and how I got here. So I went to college at Carnegie Mellon University, which is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And when I entered college, I knew that I really liked science a lot. Back in high school, I had taken a lot of advanced science and math classes, and I really enjoyed them. And as I was getting closer to graduating from high school and thinking about college, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to study. I knew that I wanted to study a science, but the problem was that I liked too many things. There were so many things I was interested in, and I had a hard time picking just one of them. And then I discovered the field of neuroscience. So as some of you might know, neuroscience is actually very interdisciplinary, meaning it draws upon a lot of different topics. So anything from biology, chemistry, physics, to psychology, and even computer science and math. All of those things are really tied together in neuroscience. So it was kind of perfect for someone like me who wanted to be able to combine all of these interests into one field. And kind of an added bonus is that as a neuroscientist, you get to explore a lot of really interesting questions about how the brain works and what makes us who we are. So it ended up being really a perfect field for me to study. And so that is what I declared as my major in my first year of college at CMU. So those of you who are in college or have graduated from college in a science field might know that a lot of times when you're in science, professors will encourage you to get involved in research in a lab. And that was also the case for me. So I got involved in a lab that was run by Dr. Nathan Urban. Here's a picture of him. And his lab works with mice to study the sense of smell. And so I spent a lot of time in that lab training mice to do tasks where they would have to use their sense of smell to navigate a windy trail on a table. This trail was drawn with a scented crayon, so they couldn't see it, but they could use their sense of smell. And I spent some time training mice on that task, as well as recording from the mice's brains to understand how they're using their sense of smell to navigate. So that was really cool as my first experience with research, but eventually I realized this wasn't quite my cup of tea. I wasn't super interested in the sense of smell. So in my sophomore year, I decided to switch labs to Dr. Sandy Kuhlman's lab, also at CMU. And her lab also works with mice, but she studies the sense of vision. So again, I got a lot of experience training mice to do tasks where they had to look at things and tell us information about what they saw. I also got some experience recording directly from the brain in various ways and analyzing a lot of neural data. So that was a really great experience. One of the really unique things about this lab is that it kind of spanned a wide range. So we weren't just talking about the biology of how the brain works, but we were also kind of asking bigger questions about how the things going on in the brain make larger behavioral things happen and kind of what makes us who we are. And those are really more about psychology than neuroscience. And so I ended up realizing that I had these dual interests, partly in neuroscience and partly in psychology. And I actually ended up double majoring. So I added a second major in psychology, and I graduated with 2 degrees. And so because I had all of this research experience and I really enjoyed what I was doing, this eventually led me to apply to graduate school. And so that's how I ended up here at Duke, where I'm currently working toward a PhD in neurobiology. And so currently, I'm working in the lab run by Dr. Jennifer Groh, shown here. And our lab works with monkeys to study how they put together what they see and hear. So it's kind of really cool that I'm able to take some of the information and the skills that I gained as an undergrad, where I was teaching mice to do things and learning about the visual system. And now I'm able to use that experience and build upon it to train monkeys and explore how vision interacts with hearing. So hopefully that gives you just a little bit of an overview about kind of my neuroscience background. And I'm happy to answer questions about that if anyone has any. But of course, what we're really here to talk about today is science policy. So as I mentioned, alongside my neuroscience experience, I'm also heavily involved with an organization called the National Science Policy Network. And what I'm hoping to do today is to tell you a little bit about science policy broadly, and then also give you an overview of what NSPN does, because I think some of you might really be interested in joining and getting involved in that organization. So before we really dive into that, just a few disclaimers. First, even though I am on the staff of NSPN, I'm not here representing them officially today. So all of the views that I present here are mine, and they don't represent NSPN's official stance. And second, we're going to be talking a lot about policy and government. Some of you may be coming from areas outside the United States, and that is awesome. I just wanted to let you know that I will be focusing specifically on policy within the US, just because that's where I'm from and what I'm most familiar with. But there are plenty of opportunities outside the US to get involved in science policy. So don't feel discouraged if you are outside of the US. You still have opportunities to get involved. So my plan for today is to briefly introduce you to what science policy is and just defining what that even means. And then we're going to divide science policy up into different ways of looking at it, or different lenses through which we can view science policy. And then we'll spend a bit of time at the end talking about careers in science policy and the types of things that you can do now while you're still in school to give yourself some skills and experience related to science policy. Okay, so let's dive in. What is science policy? Before we get there, I think it's useful for us to spend just a few minutes defining policy in general, because a lot of times as neuroscientists, we don't spend a ton of time thinking about policy. So let's just spend a few minutes and make sure that we're all on the same page about that definition. So policy, that word, comes from a Greek word polis, which means city. You might have heard this word before in some of the names of cities that we have now, such as Indianapolis, or words like metropolis, which just refers to a big city. So this Greek word polis is where we get words like politics or policy. So if polis means city, then politics just means affairs of cities or affairs of citizens, the people living in those cities. And when we talk about politics, we're really just talking about making decisions that affect groups of people all living together or working together. And policies are just the courses of action that we use to implement those decisions, such as laws or other rules or regulations. So that's policy in general. Science policy is just one specific type of policy where we're specifically making decisions about science or using science. And this is really all about connecting science to the people. So we'll dive a little bit deeper later on the different ways that you can look at science policy, but very broadly, the types of questions that you could answer with science policy include things like, what science should we do? What types of experiments should we do? What fields should we focus on? And how should we do it? And how should we make sure that it happens, such as giving money to the right types of research to accomplish the goals that we want to accomplish. So that's what science policy means very broadly. This is a good place for us to pause for questions. So I'm going to take a look at the chat here. Feel free to drop a question in the chat if you have one. Okay, I'm not seeing any new questions here so far. Feel free to drop questions in the chat throughout if you have them, and I will pause throughout and take a look. Right, so now that we know what science policy is, let's talk about why you might want to get involved in science policy. So really the motivation for science policy can be a lot of things. Often it's because people want to contribute to their community in some way. So if you want to be involved in making decisions that affect you and the community that you live in a data-based way, an evidence-based way, a science-based way, science policy might be for you. Science policy is also a good way that you could advocate for an issue that's important to you. So if you know about a current issue or challenge or a general topic area and you want to make your voice heard on that topic, science policy can be a good way to do that. And so really in general, anytime you're looking for ways to use your scientific knowledge to have a broader impact on the world, science policy is a great way to make that happen. Okay, so I mentioned that there are a few different ways to divide up science policy. And one of the really big divisions that people often talk about here is science for policy versus policy for science. So what do those mean? Science for policy means we are using science as a tool in our toolkit to help us make decisions about policy. Now, that doesn't mean that we are only using science to make decisions. There are probably a lot of other factors that would go into making a policy decision, like economic factors, social factors, personal feelings about a topic. But we just use science as a part of that whole toolkit to contribute to making decisions. So some examples of this might include decisions around COVID-19. So for the past several years, we've seen a lot of rules about what types of vaccines are available, who they are available to, when people can get those vaccines, and even things like masks. Who is required to wear masks? Where are they required? How long are they required? What types of masks are required? All of these things are able to be implemented as policies because we have scientific knowledge about them. So scientists do experiments to understand how COVID-19 works, and they use that knowledge to make a policy decision. Another example is related to climate change. So we can use our knowledge that we have about greenhouse gases and carbon emissions and how they influence climate change to make policies surrounding who is allowed to emit greenhouse gases, in what quantities are they allowed to make those emissions. All of these types of questions are using science as a tool for policy. The other side of the coin would be policy for science. And policy for science is really all about affecting the way that we do science using our policy decisions. And this can be the way science is conducted or the way science is taught. Most commonly, when we talk about policy for science, we're talking about funding for scientific research. So some of you might know that in order to do experiments in a lab, researchers require money to do that, money to pay the people to work, and money to purchase all of the equipment and supplies that they need to do those experiments. And a lot of that funding comes from the government. So any questions about where that money comes from, who gets to receive that money, and how much money they get, all of those things would be considered policy for science, because we're using a policy decision to affect how science is conducted. Another example would be any type of question about how do we teach science or how do we conduct science. So for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM spaces, such as education and workplaces. So anytime we are creating programs that help train people from diverse backgrounds, that would be policy for science. Anytime there are requirements about what types of classes you have to take, that would be policy for science. So as an example, I receive government funding from the National Institutes of Health, which is part of the federal government. And as a condition of that funding, they require that every few years I have to take a class called Responsible Conduct of Research, which basically just means I have to learn how to conduct my research ethically and responsibly so that I'm doing the right thing with my research. And so that policy that they require people to take this class would be an example of policy for science. Does anyone have questions about these divisions of science policy in general? I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but I'll take a pause here in case anyone has one. Okay, seeing none, I'll go ahead and move forward. So these are the two really broad ways to define or divide up science policy, but there are other ways that we can look at this too. So one of the ways that we can do this is by thinking about the different subject areas that might contribute to science policy. For example, we might have health. And I put this first because as people interested in neuroscience, some of you might be interested in health policy. So health policy can include anything related to mental health and healthcare for that. It could relate to other types of healthcare. It could relate to the effect of drugs on the brain. It could relate to medical devices. So if you're interested in any of those questions, that would all fall under health policy. But there are a lot of other types of policy that don't necessarily just relate to neuroscience or biology related fields. So another example would be food and agriculture. A really common example of this, something that I've seen a lot recently, is conversations around pesticides. So what is the effect of pesticides on growing crops, and what health effects does that have on the food that we eat? That would be a question encompassed under the umbrella of food and agriculture. Another example is ecology and the environment. So some of the questions that I mentioned earlier surrounding carbon emissions and general questions about climate change could all be included in this area. We also have things like water and climate more generally. So anything surrounding water quality, how do we deliver quality water to people, and any other climate related questions would be included here. This also includes some really interesting questions, such as who owns the ocean? Which countries' rules are helping to govern the ocean? Which laws apply there? That's kind of an interesting question and would be under water policy. We also have things like energy and transportation. So kind of related to those climate questions, but now more looking at how do we use alternative forms of energy and how might that relate to our transportation infrastructure? So things like electric vehicles, those types of questions. Technology in general. So this can include things that I mentioned previously, like medical devices or the technology that we use to bring about different forms of energy, or it can be things like data and security, kind of tying together with technology. So how do we keep our data safe? How do we store large amounts of data? What types of data should we store? And how does that relate to privacy? That would all be considered part of technology policy. You can also look at questions surrounding business and entrepreneurship. So this would be more along the lines of the policy for science side of things, where you are making policies that affect the way that we conduct business or the way that people might start businesses surrounding science. You can do things about education and communication. So how do we communicate science to people effectively? How do we make that information accessible? And how do we teach about science? And finally, questions surrounding ethics and responsibility would also fall here. So the example that I gave before about the responsible conduct of research course that I'm required to take, that would be an example of science policy. Basically, any question about what types of research should we do, what are the effects of our research, and how do we make our research more equitable? All of those things could fall under ethics and responsibility. So this is not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it gives you some idea of the different ways that you could slice science policy into these different subject areas. But there are also other ways that we can look at science policy. So these are the areas that you might look at, but you might be wondering, how do people actually do science policy? And so that's another way that we can divide this up. So here I'm showing you just 3 examples of the different types of activities that a person might do related to science policy. So the first example is science advocacy. And advocacy is really all about making your voice heard on a topic that is important to you. And this can look like a lot of different things. It can look like getting people to sign a petition. It can look like holding events to raise awareness about a topic. It can look like contacting your congressional representatives, either in person or with a letter to get them to take action on a topic. Basically, anytime you're trying to get your point across to someone else about your stance on an issue, that would be considered science advocacy. There are also people who do science communication. And science communication is really all about communicating scientific information to non-scientists. And so that could be things like writing. So maybe some of you have read articles about recent science discoveries. Those would be considered forms of science writing or science journalism. This can also be things that are more multimedia focused. So videos, podcasts, art, photography, any of those sort of artistic type things to communicate a science topic would fall under science communication. This can also look like social media or even in-person outreach. So as an example, when I was in college, I was part of a student group focused on neuroscience. And one of the big things that we did is we invited students from local elementary schools to come and do fun games and demonstrations and crafts to learn about the brain. So that type of event we would generally refer to as outreach, and that would be a part of science communication. And then finally, we have science diplomacy. And this is kind of an interesting one. It's the intersection between science and international relations. So this is really all about taking science policy and expanding it outside of just one country. So this can look like having scientists from different countries collaborate with one another on their science. That could be an example of science diplomacy. It could also be using science to make our international relations better or more equitable or more based on data and evidence. So basically, anytime you are expanding science policy outside of the US, that would be considered science diplomacy. So these are just some ways that people might do science policy in their jobs. But where do people actually do this? So let's talk about the settings where a person might do science policy. And the answer is basically just about everywhere, but let me just break that down a little bit and tell you what this could look like in these various settings. So we've already talked a little bit about the federal government. So I mentioned that a lot of money for scientists to do their research comes from the government. But there are also other ways that you can contribute to policy in the federal government. So let's take a step back for a minute. If you've taken any sort of civics class about the US government, then you probably know that there are 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. So the funding aspect of things usually comes from the executive branch. So if you've heard of things like the NIH, National Institutes of Health, or the NSF, National Science Foundation, these are examples of agencies within the executive branch that help contribute to science and science policy. You can also work in the legislative branch. So that would be Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. There are actually scientists who work there with the senators and representatives to help them make decisions about policies that are based on science. So lots of opportunities to do science policy in the federal government. But not all policy happens at the national level. Some of it happens more locally. So you can also do science policy in your state government. And this would actually look pretty similar to what I just described for the federal government. So most states have something like a legislature and something like an executive branch with different agencies. And so you can work there, just like in the federal government, but the only difference is you would now be contributing to more local issues. So maybe issues that specifically affect your state, you would get to contribute to those topics. You can even zoom in a little bit further and look at local government. So this can look different in different places, but it might be something like a county government. It might be at the city level, so something like a city council or a mayor. Some states have townships, which are larger than a city, but smaller than a county, and sometimes they have government type structures. So what this can look like might be volunteering on a committee or even running for office to get one of those positions and use your scientific expertise to serve your community. So these are all options within governments, but it turns out you can also do science policy outside of a government setting. So another example is nonprofits. Nonprofits are just organizations that are not part of the government, and they're usually focused around a specific cause. So this might relate to science advocacy, which we talked about earlier. A lot of nonprofits are doing advocacy around a specific topic. So they might be working toward a specific cause, trying to get more people to join them on that cause, and generally make their community better through that cause. So one really great example of this, which I'll be talking about later, is the National Science Policy Network, which is a nonprofit that provides training for scientists to engage in science policy. You can also do science policy in higher education. And this one is kind of surprising for some people because a lot of people think about university settings as being pretty separate from policy, but actually there is a connection there. So one example is that a lot of universities have something called a government relations office, which is this office where people work to stay up to date on what's happening in the government and help connect people at the university to the policymakers in the government. And so I would recommend, if you're currently at a university, that you just Google and see if you can find a government relations office at your institution. If this is something that you're interested in, I would just recommend reaching out to them directly and see if they can help you get involved in policy. Generally, they're very happy to help. It's part of their job, and it's a great way to get more involved. Another way that you can engage within higher education is teaching. So anytime someone takes a class about science policy or science communication, that has to be taught by someone. right? So the people who do that work would be doing science policy within higher education. And then we have industry, which is kind of a broad and vague term, but usually this just means any company that is not part of the government and not classified as a nonprofit. And so this can kind of look similar to some of the other rules that I've described, but a lot of times companies might try to interface with the government in some way. Maybe they're working together on a project, advising the government in some way. This can also potentially look like patents. So if a company is developing a product, the process of getting a patent for that product can sometimes be related to science policy in terms of the way that we use that product and distribute it. And then finally, you can also do independent consulting. So sometimes scientists want to just start their own business and use their scientific expertise in various ways, whether it's communicating directly with the government to provide expertise or providing training to other scientists in getting started in science policy or other areas. So hopefully this gives you just a broad overview of kind of the different ways that we might divide up science policy. And just as I said before, this is not an exhaustive list. In fact, other people have tried to create organized maps of all the different ways that you can work in policy. And so if this is something that you're interested in and you want to get a better overview of what these paths might look like, I recommend that you go visit this map. I'm happy to share these slides later so that you have this link, but you can interact with this map and zoom in and out and really see all these different paths that are available to you. It's a really great resource. Okay, this is another good place for us to pause for questions. So let me take a look at the chat and feel free to type a question there if you have one. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll go ahead and move forward. So we've talked about what science policy is, and we've talked about different ways that you can look at science policy. Some of you might be wondering, this sounds really interesting, but how do I get started? So let's move into talking about some career-related questions in science policy. So first, I just wanted to bring up, what are some skills that you might want to think about developing if you're interested in this area? And there are really a lot of skills that might be useful to you here, but these are just some of the ones that I think are really important. So they include communication, both written and oral. So being able to write about science or write about other ideas and present them to people in a clear and logical way. This also can include things like organization or time management, or just being able to manage a project. It can include event planning. This might be kind of surprising to some of you, but science policy can actually involve a lot of event planning. Maybe you are inviting the public to come learn about a topic, or you're trying to set up a lot of meetings with people. So event planning is actually, it comes in handy a lot in science policy. Things like learning how to work on a team, as well as how to work independently and lead a team, can be really important, as well as being curious to learn new things and adaptability when things don't go quite as planned. So notice that I didn't put anything on this list about neuroscience knowledge and skills, right? I didn't say that you have to know how to train a mouse or how to look at a map of the brain and label every brain region, because those are really not skills that you have to know to work in this field. In fact, there's really no specific field or subject area that is required to work in science policy. It's really more about using your training and the skills that you've learned, such as leadership and communication and organization, using all of those things to be able to think about science and policy in a critical way. That's really what's most important here. So how do you actually develop these skills? What are some things that you can do now to start getting some experience in science policy? So I'm just going to list a whole bunch of things here. You definitely don't have to do all of these. These are just some options. But if you can just pick maybe one or two of these, I think you'll be well on your way. So one thing that you can do is vote. So I realize that some of you might not be eligible to vote yet. Maybe you're not old enough. Maybe you even are from outside the US, and so you won't be able to vote in the US. But if you are eligible, I highly encourage you to register if you're not already. It's a really great way to get involved in your community and learn about the issues that are going on. Relatedly, you can also contact your representatives in Congress. So this is totally allowed and encouraged. Anytime that you see something that's going on and you have something to say about it, you are totally 100% allowed to contact the people who represent you in the government. So that includes senators and your representative. And if you don't know who those people are in your area, this is a link that you can go to. All you do is just type in your address, and based on that address, it will tell you who your representatives are and how to contact them. So that's a great resource that I would recommend if you don't know who your representatives are already. I would also recommend taking opportunities to write a lot. So I mentioned communication was a really important skill. The way to develop that skill is to write. And this can really be any type of writing. It doesn't have to be about policy. It doesn't have to be about science. It can just be about writing about some things that you think are cool and starting a blog on your own. Even writing in a journal, just getting that experience, writing a lot and getting your ideas down on paper. And then as you get more advanced, there are ways to turn that into writing about science and writing about policy. So for example, I have spent a lot of time writing with my friends and colleagues in policy about different areas in the science policy world. And we've actually published 3 papers together that ended up in a science policy journal. So that's something that you can aim for if you're interested. I would also recommend joining clubs. So I think all of you kind of have this down already because you're clearly in this organization, Simply Neuroscience, but it doesn't hurt to take a look at what else is available to you in your community or at your school and see what else you might be interested in. A lot of times you can develop a lot of transferable skills from clubs. I also mentioned previously science outreach. So this is the type of event where you invite people, often children, but it can be adults too. You invite them to come and learn about science in an engaging way. This is a really great way to practice those communication skills, especially oral communication. Student government is also a really great option. So if you're in high school, you might have something like a student council. You might have a student government type organization if you're at a university. This is a great way to kind of see how Congress works on a very small scale and get that experience very early on. Leadership is also a really important one. So this can happen in a number of ways. It can happen through clubs or through student government. It can also just be volunteering in your community and taking action on your own. Just finding some way to take ownership of a project. I think that is a really great way to get your feet wet in these policy skills. Informational interviews are also a really important one. And this might be a new term to some of you. If you don't know what this means, an informational interview is just a conversation that you can have with someone about their career. So maybe you come across someone who is doing work that you're interested in. You can ask them for just 15, 20 minutes of their time to get on the phone with you or jump on a Zoom call and explain a little bit about their career path and give their advice. A lot of times this happens online through things like LinkedIn. If you're not on LinkedIn, that's a social media and networking site specifically focused on jobs and careers. So I just wanted to give you an example of a type of message that you might send someone if you come across their LinkedIn profile and you want to do an informational interview with them. So here's what that message might look like. You can say, "Dear," the person's name, "I'm a student at your school," or whatever your current position is, "and I'm currently exploring careers and opportunities in science policy. I came across your LinkedIn profile and I saw that your experience is aligned with my interests. I'd love to learn more about how you have navigated your career path so far. Would you have a few minutes next week for a short call?" So this is not very long, right? It's kind of quick and to the point, but it's a really great way to meet people and expand your network and learn how other people have navigated their careers. So that's informational interviews. I would also recommend learning about science broadly. So when we were talking about skills, remember I said, there's no specific neuroscience topic that you have to know about. It's more about using your broad neuroscience knowledge and skills to contribute to policy. And so if you kind of just focus on science classes broadly and really try to get a general understanding, that will really serve you well. And so in a lot of ways, you might not have to work too hard at this because a lot of times you're required to take a broad range of science classes anyway, but it's just something to be aware of. And then alongside that, I'd also recommend taking advanced classes when you can. So if you're in high school, this could look like honors classes, AP classes, IB classes, if those are available to you. If you are already in college, I would recommend just taking electives if you can. So if you are majoring in a science, maybe try to take a government class or two and just get your feet wet in that area. If you really want to dive deep, there are also opportunities to take classes outside of a formal institution. So I'm not going to go too much into detail about these, but there are a lot of professional societies or independent scientists who run training classes that you can take. And so if anyone is interested in those, I'm happy to chat more about those afterward. Internships are also a really good option. Sometimes these are called fellowships. Basically, there's just an opportunity to gain real world experience and kind of learn what actually goes into a job in science policy. And then finally, I would recommend joining professional societies if you can. So there are societies related to science policy. I'm going to spend some time talking about one in particular, the National Science Policy Network, but there are also other options out there that I would recommend. Okay, so before we dive into the National Science Policy Network, I just want to pause one more time in case there are any questions. Okay, so we have a question that says, to have a career in science policy, what prior experience in the workforce do employers look for if neuroscience isn't always needed? That's a great question. So I think the exact position that you need can vary. So it's not that they're always looking for you to have a specific internship in a specific field. It's more about understanding that you have the general skills that we talked about earlier, and those skills can be developed in a really broad range of fields. It can also even just come from college. So you could potentially get a job involved in policy right out of college if you can demonstrate that through your clubs and extracurriculars, you gained these skills. I will say a lot of times in science policy, certain jobs do require you to go to graduate school. So I guess that would be the most common thing, is that they might look for prior experience as a graduate student in a science field. But it's not necessarily required for every type of science policy job. So that would be something on a case-by-case basis. You would just look at the job description and see what they're looking for. Hopefully that helps. Okay. So with the time that we have left, I just want to really quickly introduce you to the National Science Policy Network. So as I said before, I'm not officially representing NSPN today, but it is a group that I'm really passionate about, and I just want to give you a taste of what is available to NSPN members, because if you're at this session, this might be something that you would be interested in joining. So what is NSPN? Well, it is a virtual nonprofit. From what I can tell, it actually seems very similar to Simply Neuroscience. It's just that instead of neuroscience, we're talking about science policy. So our goal is to create a community around science policy and train people to become more effective advocates in their community. So I've put our social media info on our website up here. I would highly encourage you to check us out. And I'm going to just share with you a few things that we have to benefit our members. One of them is this very comprehensive resource guide. So if you are finishing this session today and you're thinking, I feel like I have so much to learn about science policy, where do I go? This is a really great guide to start with because it will show you all of the different conferences you could attend or things that you could read or accounts to follow on Twitter or classes to take to get more involved in science policy, communication, diplomacy, etc. We also have what we call training modules, which is kind of like a mini online course that dives a little bit deeper into some of the topics that I talked about today. So that's also available if you'd like to get a deeper dive into these areas. We also have a YouTube channel, which has a lot of recordings of our previous events. So we have had events surrounding anything from diplomacy to communication to different areas, subject areas such as climate change or health or basically anything you can think of. We've had a lot of events at this point. So I would encourage you to check out our YouTube channel if you want to spend a few hours diving into any of those topics. And then finally, we do have a number of programs also that can help you gain experience. So one of those is SciPol Scholars. This is an opportunity where you spend 6 weeks taking a class all about science policy. And then after the class, you're eligible to be placed with a partner organization for an internship. So this is a really great opportunity to get your feet wet if you're interested in that. And it turns out this is perfect timing because there's an info session about this event or about this program in 2 days. So if anyone is interested, you have 2 days to join NSPN and then you can join that info session and apply to the current application cycle. We also have a program called SciDeal, which stands for Science Diplomacy Exchange and Learning. And this is a similar program, but it's focused on science diplomacy. So this is a program where people come together in teams and they work with science diplomacy organizations all over the world to help solve those problems and just gain experience in diplomacy together. Then finally, we also offer funding. So if you have science policy goals that require money to get them done, such as buying books to read or attending a conference, anything along those lines, you can actually apply for funding from NSPN to cover those costs. So this is a really great option and one of the ways that you can really get value out of your NSPN membership. Okay, so that was kind of a whirlwind tour of Science Policy 101. Hopefully you learned something today and are excited to get involved in science policy. I just wanted to end with my contact info here in case anyone wants to get in touch. You can reach me via the contact form on my website, on Twitter. You can message me on LinkedIn. I'm generally very responsive in all of those places. So I'm happy to talk to you and I can of course answer any questions if there are any now. So just going to stop sharing my screen so that folks can see one another more easily. Do we have any last questions?
We can give it a minute or so. I can also enable permissions for folks to unmute if they want to raise their hands and ask live. But thank you so much, Meredith. That was so informative. I'm definitely going to go back and rewatch this video because there's so much cool info in there. So thank you. This was super, super in-depth, really informative. Really appreciate your examples as well.
So glad it was helpful. Yeah, I'm always excited to talk about science policy with folks, so happy to help.
Camille has a question. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just wondering if you could repeat the differences between science policy for federal government and state government.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say there are actually not a lot of differences. They can be really similar. The only difference would be the type of issues that you are thinking about in your job. So in the federal government, you would be thinking about nationwide problems. And in the state government, you would be thinking about problems that specifically affect your state. So maybe, as an example, if there is a certain chemical in your drinking water in your area, but it only affects a few states and not the entire country, that might be an issue that you would think about in the state government. But sort of the way that it works and the places that you work within the government might actually be pretty similar between federal and state. Does that help?
I actually have another question, if that's okay. So I know there was a slide about like policy for science and science for policy. And I was wondering if you have a career in science policy, do you typically only work in one of those sectors, or would it like would you be able to like do both?
That's a great question. So generally, each individual job would probably only be in one of those areas, but it's very easy to switch jobs and work in different areas at different points throughout your career. So I think you can make it whatever you want it to be. There's options to move around.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I think we can wrap it up for the next session, because I know there's another one coming. But thank you again so much, Meredith. I know everyone, I'll learn something new. I definitely did. And yeah, a lot of clapping emojis going on here.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.